everybody, and welcome to the first edition for spring of 2021 of Cooking Level 0. I hope you guys are all as excited as I am that 2020 is finally over. Hopefully this year is a lot better than last year. For this first video, what we're going to talk about today is going to be baking basics. So we're going to talk about the different materials you need, the different ingredients you can use, and some of the basic techniques that you generally use when you're baking. You use a combination of these three things to make every baked good you've ever heard of in your life. Baking is essentially, it's the quintessential and like the core of the phrase cooking is alchemy, because you take flour and by adding a couple more ingredients to it, you make bread, you make cakes, you make cookies, you make it into all of my personal favorites in the kitchen is all the baked goods. So, you know, it's really, it can be tough because it's definitely the area of cooking where you probably have the least wiggle room. It's the most like chemistry. If you mess up the proportions on one thing, you're gonna get a weird result. But it's also the one where you have the biggest chance to like really be able to make something completely unique and all your own. So I hope you guys learn a lot. Please don't forget to give us feedback so that we can make the future videos better and have fun. So one of the first and most important things to consider when you're baking is what equipment you need. If you don't have the right equipment, it's going to make it really hard to make anything fun or anything good. So one set of things you need to have is baking tins or trays. It's very helpful to have nonstick items that you can cook with, because then you can just kind of peel your bread out or peel your cake off. But you don't have to. If you don't have access to something nonstick, you can always put parchment down or like one of those silicone mats for baking. And those not only make cleaning that thing a lot easier, but also help prevent everything from sticking. To be honest, even if I have nonstick, I use the parchment paper just because I am lazy. I like to cook. I don't like to clean it up. So anything that makes it easier to clean, I'm all for it. On that note, you also want to have some rubber spatulas. Rubber spatulas are really great for scraping the inside of your bowls when you're done mixing whatever your batter or your dough, and making sure you get every single last bit of that. But it also makes cleanup a lot easier. So another thing you're going to want to make sure you have is called a baking scraper. You use this for several things like cutting dough and helping you start mixing and things like that. You want to make sure that you have something that's very firm and very rigid. You don't want anything that has any flexibility to it. Think of it in like Harry Potter terms. You don't want a charm wand that has a lot of switch to it. You want a really rigid wand that can blast curses at your enemies. Yeah. Okay, another thing that you can use but you don't necessarily need is going to be your electric mixer. You don't need an electric mixer. It just makes life a lot easier. You can buy a really cheap one on Amazon or at the store for like 20 bucks. You don't need like the very expensive KitchenAid or anything, but it does save you a lot of time and a lot of hassle. But half the fun for me for baking is being able to get my hands dirty and like kind of playing with slime. So, you know, it's fine. And then of course the other items you're gonna want bowls for mixing. You're gonna want a flat surface, usually like a cutting board or a countertop, that you can either oil or flour to be able to knead dough and things like that. You're also going to want your measuring spoons and your measuring cups. If you don't remember how to use this, you guys can check out last session's videos. Yes, self-plug, woo-hoo. And finally, you're also going to want things like whisks to help you mix and properly blend all of the ingredients together. Or you're going to end up with clumpy stuff, and that's never good. Okay, so the next section we want to talk about is your ingredients, and a lot of this is going to be covering different types of flour, because what type of flour you use in baking is extremely important, not only to what you're making, but also what other ingredients you have to add to it. For example, your strong white flour, which is usually called like bread flour, it has higher protein in it, so it's better at giving like your dough like elasticity, and it makes it rise more, so that's how you make bread. Whereas plain white flour is usually more crumbly in the end, and you usually use it for like biscuits or cakes. You also have self-rising flour that has like baking soda or baking powder already added into it, so you don't have to add those types of like baking agents, but it doesn't do so good for like bread because it's plain flour as a base rather than the strong flour as a base. Finally, there's like wholemeal flour, which is best if it's stone ground, and that's basically has the highest nutrients, but it also absorbs a lot of water, so you have to knead it for longer. Finally, there's spelt flour, which I just learned about for the first time. So basically, it's an ancient grain that people who have gluten intolerance actually find they can sometimes tolerate it. So even though it does have some gluten, it's like an ancient version of it, I guess. And so you can sometimes use it even if you can't have other gluten containing grains, basically. So I want to try it, actually. I'm curious now. Finally, the last 3 ingredients, the most important. First is yeast. Yeast can be the scary part of baking because it can also be fun because you can raise your own little yeast and give it a name, and it's very fun. But it can also be really daunting because there's a lot of things that can kill it. There's a lot of rumors about how you're supposed to bake with it. And if you do it wrong, you're probably going to end up from either something overflowing your tin or a cracker. So it's very important to be very careful with this part. This is the most chemistry part of this chemistry set. But you can also get things at the store to help you. Like you can get little packets of active dry yeast that come in a small enough amount that you're probably not going to, explode your dough. And you could also get ones that, are just generally easier to blend. They have, or they're long acting, so you don't have to worry about messing up necessarily because it'll give more rises later, which we'll talk about in a second. Finally, salt adds flavor to your dough, but you want to keep it as far away from the yeast as possible because while sugar feeds the yeast, salt kills the yeast. Think of your yeast like little snails, and you don't want to put any salt anywhere near them. Finally, water. Water determines how much the dough is going to rise and what texture it's going to have. Plain tap water is fine, but you do want to be careful adding it in a little bit at a time because if you add too much, you're just going to have batter and not dough, and then you're going to have to try to add a bunch of flour back in. It's just a mess. So be careful with your water, but you can use tap water. It's totally fine. Okay, so next is some of the techniques involved in baking. A lot of them kind of center around mixing your ingredients. Generally speaking, you want to start by putting your dry ingredients in your bowl. You want to make sure, once again, yeast, salt, very far apart. But then you'll add your fats, which is usually like eggs or butter or margarine, and then you're going to add a quarter of your water, just a little bit of your water, and you're going to start squishing it together. Like I said, it's like slime, it's kind of fun. You're going to squish it together like a squishy or like a stress ball, basically, until it kind of becomes like this clumpy batter. It's not going to look right at first. It's okay, don't worry. Then you're going to pour it onto an oiled or floured surface. You might want to consider oiled instead of floured because it doesn't affect the consistency of your dough as much, and it also keeps it from getting sticky on your hands. But if you already did the squishing part, your hands are already covered, so it's fine. Actually, kneading the dough with your squishy hands will probably help clean them off a lot. But you're going to put it onto an oiled or floured surface, and then you're going to start kneading it. Basically, you need to start kneading it by stretching it out, folding it on itself, and stretching it out again. And you're going to do that for like 8 to 10 minutes until it becomes a cohesive ball, basically, and it has like a little soft skin on it. So that's basically how you make your little dough bread. But we're going to go more in detail with that later. So as far as mixing, there's a few different ways of mixing, and it's going to be different depending on what kind of recipe you're doing. So for example, you have beating, where you're like vigorously mixing it, trying to incorporate as much air as you can. You have blending, where you're just mixing all the ingredients, trying to get everything kind of even, but you're not really going at it. You have creaming, where you're taking softened fat and sugar and trying to incorporate air into it, so it's the vigorous thing again. You also have cutting, where you're going to be taking that baking scraper and you're going to be cutting the fat into the flour, and that's to make clumps of it and make it kind of even. That's mostly for like biscuits and stuff like that. Some of the next techniques you're going to be using a lot for mixing include folding, where you're like very gently taking like a wooden spoon or a rubber spatula and kind of literally just folding in like whipped cream or eggs or stuff like that, where you want to keep that incorporated air that you did with the whisking, you want to make sure that you keep some of that air. So you're trying to be very gentle as you're mixing in like the whipped cream. Finally, there's kneading, where you're working the dough to get the gluten going. When you're done kneading also, you should be able to kind of stretch it to like 8 inches. So not this big, but you know, this big. But you should be able to stretch it because you're looking for that elasticity. Finally, there's stirring, where you're just gently mixing together the ingredients until they're blended. There's sifting, where you use a fine mesh sieve or fine mesh colander, it doesn't matter. But basically your goal is to just kind of get out any lumps in what the dry ingredients you're putting in. So that just helps make mixing easier. And then whipping is beating vigorously to incorporate air. If you've ever handmade whipped cream, it takes a long time. There's a note. When you're mixing milk into your dough, you want to make sure you use warmed milk instead of cold milk, because it's easier for the yeast to not be as affected by it if it's warm instead of cold. Okay, so once you've kneaded your dough, what do you want to do with it afterwards? There's actually several steps to take from kneading your dough to actually putting it in the oven. This is actually more related to bread rather than anything like cookies or cakes or anything, but it's still good information to know. The first thing you need to do after you knead your dough is to let it rise. So basically what you're doing is you're going to put it in a lightly oiled bowl. You're going to put a tea towel over it or cling wrap over it, just trying to keep as much outside air from coming in as possible, because it will start to form a little crust on the ball of dough and it's not fun. Then what you want to do is you want to leave it somewhere to be able to rise until it's double its size. You don't want to worry about trying to speed this process up. It's actually better for it the slower it goes. The slower it goes, the more flavor you're going to get. So you can even put these in the fridge overnight and let them rise that way. That's totally fine. The next step after it's risen, you'll know that it's finished rising when it starts to make little creases on the top, or it starts to deflate. If it starts to deflate, you want to move on to the next step. You don't want to leave it anymore. So the next step is knocking back the dough. And you're literally, basically, you see videos like punching the dough and letting it deflate. It's kind of fun. I'm sorry, I'm weird. But your goal is to basically, you're re-kneading it kind of. You're punching it, getting as much air out as you can. So you want to turn it over onto an oiled or a floured surface and start using your heels and folding, kind of like you were when you were kneading, just to knock out as much air as you can. You're not really stretching it, but you're still using your heels, and very similar to kneading. The next thing you want to do is you want to shape your dough at this point. So during this phase, you get to play around with it. You can make just a regular loaf of bread, or you can make something really, really artistic. And it's fun to play with. So it's a little piece of art. So you get to shape your dough at this point. Then after that comes the proofing phase. So in the proofing phase, you're basically letting your dough rise again. And you also want to keep it covered during this phase so it doesn't create that skin we talked about earlier. You want to see, how you see if this is done is you want to very gently press on it, and if the dough starts to slump or crease, it's overproofed. Basically what you want is when you touch it for it to spring back but not start to deflate. And if it starts to deflate on its own, it's overproofed. If it overproofs, then what you need to do is you need to knock it back again and reshape it. So basically, yeah, you have to start over at like step 4, sorry. But once you've gotten it proofed, then you get to put it in the oven. There's several methods for putting it in the oven depending on if you want like a really browned crust. You can use stuff like egg washes. If you want like a really light crust, I tend to be more of a light crust person. You can put a container of water in the bottom of your oven. I recommend a baking pan. You want something oven proof in the bottom of on the bottom rack of your oven as you're cooking your bread, and that'll help prevent it from cracking and also keep it a lighter crust. So that is basically all the baking information I have for you guys today. You may now go out and bake. Baking is a great idea during the winter as well because it's always cold, and it's a great way to warm up your house while also getting food at the end. So, you know, it's nice and cozy. So if you guys want, because I want you guys to. You guys can email us pictures of what you do with the baking so that I can see it too, because I live vicariously through you guys. But I would love to see what you guys do, and we would love to get reviews from these videos. So if you guys email us at any of our contact information, it'll get to the right person eventually. Don't forget that we have new programs starting February through April. We still can't have you guys in the branch for programs, but we are doing a ton of virtual programs. We have stuff for every single person, basically from age 0 to age 102. So, we have tons of stuff, and we would love to see you guys virtually at them. We try to make sure we cover all the bases so you guys have something really awesome to be able to see while we're still locked down. So I hope everybody is safe and has a happy new year, and I will see you guys next time.